Imagine how you might react if one morning you learned the place that you had always called home was suddenly split in half overnight. Barriers had gone up. People who try to cross are turned away. You weren't consulted about this. You didn't give your consent. You didn't even know that it was going to happen. It just happened. And now you're separated, perhaps from your family, or a lover, or a job, or your school, or places that you hope to see in the future and plans that you had made for the rest of your life. So, what do you do now? And then also consider this. In these first hours of division, before the division is entirely permanent and impassable, you might still have the chance of flight from one side to the other. But as the clock starts to tick down, with every moment that passes, the division is hardening. It's becoming more difficult to cross. So there's the question. What are you now willing to risk? What you decide in this moment, whether to stay or go, might very well determine the rest of your life. The Berlin Wall was a vivid symbol of the Cold War division of the world, and it stood as a real deadly barrier for 28 years. The main point of this lecture is that both its sudden construction and then its sudden fall came as nearly complete surprises. They were difficult for contemporaries to really even wrap their minds around. In each case, it seemed as if the impossible had just happened. So we need in both cases to undertake a disciplined act of historical imagination, to think our way back to those days, to unknow what we now know in our own present, and look at it all with a fresh view that will allow us to appreciate the complexities and difficulties of those past moments. Where did it all begin? Long before the building of the Berlin Wall, the city of Berlin had a storied past. It started actually as a mere fishing village on the great northern European plain, but then had grown into the vast royal capital of the German state of Prussia-Brandenburg, which became famous for its outsized militaristic power and its relentless expansion. And then Berlin became the capital of the German Empire that emerged around Prussia in 1871. It was a bustling, roaring metropolis. And the Brandenburg Gate downtown, topped by the Statue of Victory upon a chariot, projected an image of glory and power. Then, notoriously, when the Nazis came to power in 1933, they turned Berlin into a stage for their own marches, their swaggering and hate-filled propaganda. And Hitler planned a campaign from Berlin to conquer Europe with his war machine and put his other radical plans into action, while also conducting a genocide to racially remake the continent, the Holocaust. The result of this was not a 1,000-year empire, as the Nazis had promised, but total destruction. Berlin became literally a field of ruins, and here is the Brandenburg Gate in a destroyed state by 1945. Here, a scene of the Potsdam Place in ruins as well. By 1945, the victorious Allied powers took possession of the city and divided it among themselves, as indeed they divided the territory of Germany as a whole. The victor powers were the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, and France. But their uneasy alliance had been strained even during the war and now broke down. So Berlin would become ground zero for the emerging Cold War, one that saw the battle of ideologies and prescriptions for the future of the human race. On the one hand, championed by the Soviet Union, communism foresaw a future of planned economies, the abolition of economic inequalities, the growth of a strong state that eventually would fade away as the millennium arrived. By contrast, Western democracies championed representative forms of government, free economies, and a capitalist system. Occupied Berlin proved to be an especially precarious spot in this global struggle, because while Berlin was divided into 4 sectors between the victors, the city itself lay 100 miles inside the overall Soviet zone of occupation in Eastern Germany, far from the Western zones. So it proved tremendously vulnerable to pressure and was a flashpoint for conflict. As a result of the growing Cold War divide, a West Germany arose and an East Germany, both claiming to represent the German people as a whole. In the West, this was the Federal German Republic, which was sponsored by the United States and its allies. And in the East, the German Democratic Republic, sponsored by the Soviet Union. Irked by this unstable state of affairs, Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, tried a heavy-handed tactic. He tried to blockade West Berlin in 1948, to choke it off and to force concessions from his former allies. However, the Americans and the British reacted in an unexpected way. Rather than starting World War III or giving in, they used technology to implement a dramatic airlift to supply the civilian population of West Berlin for 11 months. They used bombing planes to fly in supplies to keep the civilian population equipped and surviving. And Stalin eventually was forced to call off his attempt to throttle West Berlin. More historic events took place soon afterwards. When Stalin died in 1953, there were hopes for fundamental change. East Berlin became the scene of a grassroots revolt, the so-called Berlin Workers' Uprising, in German, the Arbeiteraufstand. Striking East Berlin workers had started to make economic demands, but then these cascaded into political slogans as well. They began calling for free elections and an end to one-party rule. Soviet tanks were brought in to crush the workers, and the Soviets saved the East German communist regime that they had sponsored. But the result was that the ideological claim of the East German communists to really represent the working classes and their interests was left in tatters after this heavy-handed violence. Moreover, for the next few years, an ominous thing was happening, slowly, gradually, but with building force, that represented a real threat from the perspective of the East German leaders and their Soviet patrons. The most talented people, those who had most drive and ambition, especially from the younger generation, were draining out of East Germany, leaving for West Germany. They were essentially voting with their feet. In 1952, the East Germans had closed the land border between the zones of West Germany and East Germany, but this closure proved, for one reason, incomplete and porous, and that was because of Berlin. Berlin, as you can see in this image, was a city that, even though it was divided, was still formally under shared control by the victors of World War II. And that meant that one could travel across its barriers. So somebody from a corner of East Germany might very well decide to travel to Berlin and then simply walk across to the western part of the city. Once in the West, they could travel onwards to Western Germany, where citizenship was automatically granted to Germans. This represented a mass phenomenon. From 1949 to 1961, some 2.5 million fled in this fashion from East Germany to West Germany. And the very fact that they were the cream of the crop, the young and the energetic, meant that the communist leaders of the East were determined to put a stop to this. Those leaders that we need to consider most of all were the East German communist leader Walter Ulbricht and the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. These leaders couldn't decide precisely what needed to be done, and they debated among themselves. Ulbricht demanded a radical solution to close off any access to the border. But Khrushchev was worried about what the implications might be globally. The Soviets were concerned that any such closing off of Berlin might be tremendously provocative And it might even be, they worried, physically impossible. How do you close off an entire half of a city? Could it even be done? The East German communists constantly badgered their Soviet patrons to just go ahead and do it. But the Soviets remained reluctant, and the problem continued in Berlin, even as the inner German border across the territories of the two German states closed. By the summer of 1961, a kind of crisis point was being reached. 1,000 people a day were crossing from East Berlin to West Berlin. So after 8 years of arguing to the Soviets that it was necessary to close the border, the East German communists got permission. The historian Hope Harrison has a wonderful book about how the East Germans essentially became the tail wagging the dog of their great superpower patron in the Cold War. And it has a wonderful title, Driving the Soviets Up the Wall. So now, without advance warning, but finally with the approval of Khrushchev and the Soviet Union, the East German police went into action under the command of Security Forces Chief Erich Honecker. Suddenly, police and armored vehicles closed off the boundary line between East and West Berlin. This was the planned in advance operation named the Operation Rose. So the Berlin Wall went up on August 13th, 1961, on what should have been a quiet and peaceful Sunday morning. The police set up blockades, barriers of barbed wire, fences, and represented a human barrier as well. This came as a shock to the world. But the surprise move actually also intersected with a sudden development in the space race. The Soviets appear to have deliberately scheduled the flight of one of their cosmonauts into outer space to coincide with the building of the wall. Was this meant to emphasize their superiority on Earth and in space, or was it meant to distract from these terrestrial events?